Hi, everybody. I'm so glad that you could join us today for a celebration of a movie that really changed cinema history. And I hope we're going to be able to talk about much of the background and the history and the making of the film, but I'm sure we won't be able to cover it all. I just want to thank you for coming and let's talk about Jaws. My name is Linda DeLibero, and I've been teaching film for a long time, and I grew up on films like this. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of a context for what was happening in 1975 when this movie appeared on the horizon, on the sea horizon. And I also wanted to say hello from my shark puppet friends. And I promise you, I'm not going to act out the film with these. In fact, I'm going to put them away now. That's my little sight gag for the day. In 1975, Hollywood was in a very peculiar position. It was that moment when the studio system, after, 50, 60 years, was really breaking down, and it harbored the entrance of a whole new kind of cinema by a lot of young filmmakers. I personally remember that's the time I grew up and fell in love with film. And so my feeling about Jaws when it first came on the scene was pretty ambivalent. My friends and I would say this was pretty typical of our whole generation, were in love with movies that we thought we were very sophisticated. We were watching French films, the French New Wave, and really discovering the old Hollywood directors like Hitchcock and Hawks and Ford. And we were also watching these new young directors coming up who were making films that were very, very different from the Hollywood norm, like Martin Scorsese and Robert Altman, Stanley Kubrick. These were the films that we loved. And so when Jaws kind of took over and became really the first blockbuster, there were a lot of feelings that this was going to change Hollywood. And indeed, I would say that Steven Spielberg and George Lucas after him took a lot of flack over the years for ushering in the age of the blockbuster. Jaws was a film that very quickly, within, I think, 2 months, broke the previous highest grossing film record, which was The Godfather in 1972, and ended up grossing a whopping $458 million, I think, within a year of its release, which was phenomenal. It was also a film that ushered in a new way of publicizing movies. Universal, the producers, the studio that produced the film, had decided that they were going to try for the very first time TV advertising, which strangely enough, nobody had ever thought of before. So this film was pushed on television for weeks before it was released. And when they actually released the film, they did something that also was a novel approach. They block booked the film. At first, they were going to book the film into 1,000 theaters all over the country, which was pretty extraordinary. And then when they had the first couple of previews and they realized how much the audience was responding to this, they kind of pulled back on that and only booked it into 458 theaters so that they could build on this. And I think that had a lot to do with the film over a matter of just a few weeks becoming a cultural phenomenon. But that was not the way that movies were booked in the old days. And this kind of block booking and massive advertising on television did really change the game. And because it seemed to work so well, obviously the film had a lot to do with this too, it became a kind of a consciousness shifting idea about how much money movies could make and how much you would need to spend as a studio on promoting a film ahead of time in order to make it a success. And I think that was the mentality that kind of took hold that's really still with us today in a lot of ways. That if you advertise a film enough, if you push it enough ahead of time, you can make your money back and more, even unlike Jaws, if the film is not that great. So there were a lot of mixed feelings from people who really love movies when the film came out. And I have to admit, I was one of them. I know I saw the movie. I can't remember. I wasn't, all that old, but I do remember seeing it. I remember obviously being taken with it. I don't think anybody who saw it on that initial run could have said they had no response to the film, because it's all about the response. But I also kind of thought, this is, a kind of cliche of a movie. It's really about response and reaction, and it's not a serious film. And, when you're young, you kind of have a snobby feeling about some of the things that you look back on now that you really appreciate. And this is certainly one of them. Obviously, Steven Spielberg has proved over and over again to be a spectacularly, not only successful filmmaker, but a very gifted one. And today, when I look at this movie, I really appreciate it in a way that I don't think I could have when I was a teenager. It is a movie that is really extraordinary in terms of its ability to make you think that it's just a kind of Hollywood summer fun film. But when you start to look at it, you not only notice how incredibly skillful Spielberg was as a filmmaker. At a very young age, he was 27 when he made this film, and also how much he understood his characters, how much he understood about making characters who spoke to us in a way that really went beyond the superficial characterizations that were in Peter Benchley's bestseller, on which the film is, kind of loosely based. Spielberg really felt that the characters in Benchley's novel were very flat, were also pretty unappealing. In fact, it seemed as if the whole purpose of these characters was to have the reader feel gleeful when they were eaten by sharks. And Spielberg quickly understood that these people had to be more substantial. And I would argue that the film is very much of its time, but it's also an eternal film, because those ideas that he was working with are still very resonant today. The film obviously came out not that long after the Watergate scandal. And so a lot of people at that time really felt that this was a movie about, innocent bystanders who were really prey to the forces of authority. The mayor of the town is the evil one who will not allow the beaches to be closed, sort of an obliviousness to anything but making a profit. The corruption of that was clearly speaking to a post-Watergate audience. But the film beyond that is also, I think, about masculinity and modes of masculinity, and how an old-fashioned way of being a man is giving way to a new definition. And we see that very clearly in these three characters. Obviously, we have Quint, who's the old timer, and that wonderful pivotal scene where he speaks about his experience on the Indianapolis. And of course, he's the one who dies. This was not true in the book. I think all three of these protagonists die in the end and are killed by the shark. So it's almost as if we're paying homage to this old way of being, the sort of macho Hemingway-esque character, and giving way to a new type of almost an ordinary everyday man in the shape of Brody, who is really struggling with his own impotence throughout the film. You can see it in that amazing clip that we started with, where we have this guy who, like Steven Spielberg, cannot go into the water because he's terrified of it, and he is forced into being in a situation where he's watching his own son out there in the water, and he can't go in and save him because of his own fears. There's that brilliant shot that is very famous of the what's called the vertigo effect, when we see Brody's reaction to the attack on Alex Kintner, where we have this the lens zooms in and the camera moves back, and so it's this almost mind blowing effect that is so powerful. We clearly identify with Brody, and yet we also sense that this is a guy who is, escaping from the realities of life. He's left New York. He's come to this little town. He's got all kinds of excuses about why he's done that. And when he's faced with his first crisis, of course, he's almost virtually paralyzed there on the edge of the water. And his wife has to go in and rescue the son. And there's something very shameful about that. And of course, he has to redeem himself, which he does spectacularly at the end of the film when he's the one who finally triumphs and kills the shark. And then, of course, we have Hooper. And my colleague David is going to talk about the scientific aftermath of the film in a very different way and different consequences. But I do think that for some of the negative consequences that the film had on our perception of sharks, there was also this scientist at the heart of the film who was also very easily identifiable, and who the audience is meant to identify with. Hooper is all brains technician, uses all the modern newfangled things, and Quint scoffs at that, is really disdainful of his approach to hunting sharks. And yet it's his prowess and his likability and his ability to see a way through and to approach this in a way that was very rational as opposed to emotional, that I think popularized the idea that scientists are just, ordinary guys who are trying to do their work. And so by the end of the film, we've really said goodbye to an old way of being a man in the world, and are embracing the two who survive, who become buddies, and together with the sort of everyman approach that Brody has with his fears and his, sense that he's not really up to the task and doesn't really know how to do anything very well. And of course, Hooper, who is triumphing with his scientific prowess. The film, I think, very famously was, as one executive producer put it 20 years after the fact, it was the most difficult film ever made to this day. It was a nightmare. The making of the film, I think probably the most famous aspect of it that most people have heard about are the mechanical sharks that were invented purposely for the movie by one of the greatest special effects people on the planet at the time, Walter Metty. They didn't work. And they didn't work because nobody had factored in the effect of salt water on hydraulics and all of the machinations that had to be used to get these three sharks that they were going to use, that they constructed. The whole apparatus weighed 12 tons. I think you can probably imagine what that must have been like logistically to haul those things all the way to Martha's Vineyard, where the film was shot. And so Spielberg was faced with a challenge that nobody had anticipated. In the beginning, when Zanuck and Brown, who were the producers, bought the rights to the film and decided to produce the film, they had the rather ridiculous notion that for the shark shots, they could just get a real shark and a trainer and have the shark learn some tricks and everything would be great. Well, they quickly realized that that was absolutely ridiculous. And so these mechanical sharks, who were all dubbed Bruce after Steven Spielberg's lawyer, they failed. So let's go to plan B, which is we don't see the shark. And of course, you will notice, if you're paying attention, that that shark is invisible until that amazing moment, probably the biggest shock in the film, when Brody is serving them, throwing the chum overboard and pops up out of the water. The shark worked that day, and they weren't happy with the way it looked, but it didn't really matter. So the barrels were invented so that we could visualize where the shark was. That was not planned. It was an improvisation. So the other thing that was really a nightmare on the shoot was that Spielberg, being young and very stubborn and very insistent that this was going to be not just another sort of summer entertainment, but a really great film, decided that they were going to have to shoot on the water. And you can imagine, in the old days of Hollywood, everybody who shot a film on water, they shot it at a studio in a tank. It was extremely rare to actually go out into the ocean and shoot a film. And there was a good reason for that. One of them was that obviously boats are constantly moving. So as soon as they would set up a shot and the light was right, everything would be in a different place and they'd have to start all over again. The other thing that Spielberg insisted on was that he wanted the sense that these three guys were really out there alone, far from land, where nobody could really come out and rescue them. This was a great concept. I think it's essential to our feeling of, the three men in isolation, but it also meant that not having control over the boats that were coming over the horizon, every time a boat went by, if they were shooting, they had to stop and wait until the boat crossed all the way over their line of sight. And of course, as soon as that was out of the way and they set up again, another boat would come. Some days on this shoot that lasted at least twice as long as was planned for, and obviously cost about twice as much, they maybe were able to get a couple of seconds of footage. This made Spielberg a kind of pariah on the set because he was insisting that things had to be done in this rigorous way. It paid off in the end, but while they were all there, it was extremely difficult for the crew and the cast to be out there every day and basically isolated from their families, from the mainland. And there's a story that when the last day of shooting would come, Spielberg heard that they were going to drown him. And they were so angry with him. And, he was this young whippersnapper, and the crew were all experienced guys from old Hollywood. So he actually left the set on the last day of shooting without letting anybody know. He basically escaped and went to Boston with Richard Dreyfuss and immediately had a kind of nervous breakdown. He has never said that this was a film that he enjoyed making. In fact, over the years, he has not really particularly liked to talk about it, even though it obviously changed his life and gave him carte blanche to do whatever he wanted to do in Hollywood going forward, which the next step was Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The film is also notable for the effect that it had on culture. Obviously, many, many iterations of the shark film, none of which were anywhere near, I think, as good as the original. And the feeling that sharks were the enemy. One of the great things in movie terms about a shark as the villain is that you can't anthropomorphize it. It doesn't seem to have any personality or feelings. And as Hooper says at one point, it's the perfect specimen. It just sleeps, eats, and makes babies. So it's basically an eating machine. You can project any of your feelings about fear, death, horror onto it, and you can never have any sympathy for it. At least that was definitely the premise of the film, and of taking this animal that, I'm sure people had fear of sharks before this movie came up, but nowhere near the level that this film generated. And I can speak for myself and saying that after I saw it, I don't think I've ever gone into the ocean again without thinking about what could happen. Um, it's that has had a very detrimental effect on the population of sharks. People, needlessly hate them, even though shark attacks are actually very rare. But the film was just evince these such primal feelings. And I think that if you had chosen another kind of predator, it might not have worked. But it's also a film that very much manipulates our feelings about death. There's a world above the surface, and there's a world beneath the surface. And our feelings about what lies beneath the unknown. It's a little bit like everybody in the film is kind of going about their business and laughing and having a good time, being very hedonistic on the beach, and covering up the feeling that life could be altered at any time. Right now, I'm actually going to give the screen over to my colleague, David Shiffman, and he's going to talk a lot more about the effect that the film had on the fate of sharks in the contemporary world. And very happy to pass it over to you, David.
Well, hello everybody. My name is Dr. David Shiffman, and I am a marine conservation biologist focusing on the study of sharks and the author of Why Sharks Matter, which is a book about shark science and conservation from Johns Hopkins University Press. I have been thinking a lot about the role that Jaws has played in my world of shark science and conservation in recognition of this anniversary. I've written about it, I've done a bunch of interviews about it. And the short answer is Jaws has had an absolutely enormous impact on sharks as well as on shark science and conservation. A thing that you might not know about sharks is that they are some of the most threatened vertebrate animals in the world. About 37% of all known species of sharks and their relatives are assessed as threatened by the IUCN Red List, something that has gotten dramatically worse in the 50 years since Jaws came out. In fact, we've lost almost half of all individual sharks in the 50 years since Jaws came out. And these are animals that were already ancient when the first dinosaurs walked on land. There were sharks swimming in the ocean before there were trees on land and before Saturn had its rings. These are animals that have been around for 450 million years, and since my parents graduated from college, we've lost about half of them. That is a time frame that overlaps very nicely with Jaws. However, Jaws is certainly not primarily responsible for this. Jaws did, however, have a massive, massive impact on public perception of sharks and their conservation. Lots of people are absolutely terrified of sharks. Even Linda mentioned that she doesn't go in the ocean anymore without thinking about, is there a shark there? This is something that most movies don't do. I for one, after watching the Final Destination movies, I don't drive behind logging trucks on the highway, but I also do not allow that. Well, I know that that's an irrational fear, and I don't allow it to influence how I vote for forestry practices. It does influence how people vote for beach safety practices and the policy solutions for ocean conservation that they support. The reason why people are so afraid of, or the reason why people's fear of sharks has influenced shark conservation is not that it made people go out and want to kill sharks. What's happening to sharks is unsustainable fishing practices. But the public fear of sharks, which was exacerbated enormously by Jaws, made it so it was much harder to get people to care about shark conservation. I give public talks about shark science and conservation all over the world, many of which as part of the book tour for Why Sharks Matter. And whenever I say 37% of all known species of sharks and their relatives are threatened with extinction, there's always someone who says, good, how can we get 100% of them threatened with extinction? The fact that so many people are absolutely terrified of sharks, which many of them trace back to Jaws, makes it harder for us to care and lobby and to elicit public support to lobby for conservation. And that is a big problem, not only for sharks, but for the oceans as a whole and for humans. Sharks play vital roles in keeping coastal and oceanic ecosystems healthy. There's a reason why the book is called Why Sharks Matter, not why I personally like sharks and don't want them to be hurt, because that makes me sad. Human beings depend on healthy food chains off of our coasts. They provide billions with a B of humans with food security and tens of millions of humans with jobs and livelihoods. These include many of the poorest humans on Earth. When you lose the top of the food chain, it can destabilize the entire food chain. Many of you are probably familiar with the story of the wolves at Yellowstone, that people didn't want wolves in the national park because wolves are scary and who wants wolves? And when we got rid of the wolves, their prey, deer and elk, exploded. There was nothing keeping their numbers in check, and they overgrazed and it destroyed the whole forest. The same type of thing can happen in the ocean. So we are better off with healthy shark populations off our coasts than we are without them. Sharks are also absolutely not a serious safety threat to you and your family. If you go in the water, there is almost certainly a shark near you, and it knows you're there, but it doesn't bother you, and you would probably never know it was there. I've been swimming with sharks all over the world, and I have hundreds of pictures that I've taken, but they're almost always of sharks swimming away from me really fast because that is normally what they do when they see a person. Uh, the media has a major role to play in combating this fear because they're a major cause of it. A study that colleagues of mine in Australia did was absolutely staggering that 36% of all reported shark attacks, in sarcastic air quotes, reported in Australia, and when that happens, it's headline news all over the world, shark attack in Australia, and people picture the scenes from Jaws. But in 36% of reported Australian shark attacks, the shark did not physically touch the human at all. It swam near them in a way that the person reported that they found threatening. And that gets reported all over the world as shark attack in Australia. In a typical year, more humans are killed by flower pots falling on their head from above when they walk down the street than are killed by sharks. As a social media guy, and you can follow me at Why Sharks Matter on every platform if you want to hear more rants about this all the time. As a social media guy, I love this one. More people fall off cliffs while trying to take a selfie of the scenery behind them than are killed by sharks in a typical year. More people are bitten by other people on the New York City subway system every year than are bitten by sharks in the whole world. And when I give these public talks, I can always tell who's been to New York City because there's always some people going, that's weird, and some people going, yeah, I can see it. So sharks are not something you need to worry about in terms of safety, a safety risk to you and your family, and they do play very, very, very valuable ecosystem roles. Unfortunately, many species of sharks are threatened and face very, very serious conservation challenges. And that's a lot of the things that I work on as a Washington, D.C. based ocean conservation scientist. This is going to be a big year for shark conservation on the international scale. This is a year when the Convention on Migratory Species, a UN biodiversity treaty, meets. This is going to be a year when CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, meets. If you follow me on social media at Why Sharks Matter, I'll be talking a lot about upcoming deadlines, how people can help, how people can get involved, and things like this. Uh, there is something there's just Joe is mentioning something in the comments that I was just about to mention that the impact on sharks and shark science and shark conservation from Jaws has not been all bad. There is a generation of marine scientists who decided that they wanted to become a marine scientist because they saw Jaws, because they saw the Hooper character, and many of those people have played important roles in shark conservation as well as major discoveries. I suppose it could be argued that we wouldn't have needed them to fix these problems if the problems weren't caused in the first place. But certainly, lots of people became ocean scientists because of the Hooper character. I actually got a chance to meet Richard Dreyfuss a couple years ago, and I mentioned that to him, and seemed very, very entertained by it. Uh, so Jaws has very much a mixed legacy in my world. It is often blamed by shark conservation enthusiasts for the massive decline in sharks, even though it at best made or at worst made it harder for us to fix the problem. It did not cause the problem. It inspired a whole generation of scientists to get involved in studying these things and working on solutions. Uh, and whenever I give public talks, someone asks me about Jaws. There's no one who doesn't know what this movie is, which gives me, in some cases, some advantages when I'm doing public science engagement, public outreach type talks. I don't need to start my talks with, "This is what a shark is. You probably haven't heard of it." And Jaws is in no small part responsible for that. But there is certainly there are sharks that are dead now because of this movie that would not be dead otherwise. Some of those are endangered species. Some whole populations are threatened with extinction and would not be otherwise. So it's a really complicated legacy. This week is a very busy and confusing time for me and my people. But it has been really great to have the opportunity to speak about this and to speak about the real science of sharks and the real science of shark conservation with so many different audiences, including this one. Uh, and yeah, that is just about everything that I wanted to say here. At this point, I'm happy to move to Q&As, Joe. Thank you very much for listening again at Why Sharks Matter on social media. If you think of a question later, if you're watching a recording of this, you can send me a message there and I'd be happy to answer it.
And I see that we actually have a couple of questions already, and I know I can take one, and David, I think the other
Sure.
one definitely be on your your watch. And first, I want to say about the special effects. That's a really great question because um, I'm not sure. I'm sure that in Hollywood, people had heard about the disaster of the mechanical sharks, and that spread. I think that's probably one of the things that most people know. If they know something about that production, it's about Bruce and the failure of Bruce. And I'm sure that other filmmakers took that as an abject lesson in being very careful. But then everything eventually, Jurassic Park is mostly, those are CGI movies. So this problem goes away very quickly. Um, People in Hollywood, in the special effects department, I think right around the late 70s and early 80s, that was kind of the last gasp of actually creating these kinds of monsters for the film, the screen. And in some ways, it was a kind of sad thing because these were real craftsmen who, would spend hours building these things, dragons. One of the alumni that you may not know about, Matthew Robbins, who graduated in '65 and actually wrote Steven Spielberg's first feature, Sugarland Express, worked on a movie called Dragon Slayer in 1981. And they built everything, these massive dragons, little dragons, all the special effects were created by hand. And that was pretty much the last movie for which that was true. Then computers start to take over. So then they have the problem of, well, does this really look real at all? And you can see at some point certain directors like George Miller with the Mad Max films eschews CGI almost altogether to give a sense of realism that those old movies were the ones that, you can't replicate that with CGI. And we have, what is the part of Jaws that makes every marine biologist cringe, David?
Oh man, there's just some throwaway lines in there that are just silly, but also the whole basis of Jaws is this idea of the rogue shark, that there's one individual shark that is just born bad and develops a taste for human flesh, and it's going to just keep killing and killing, and the only thing we can do is to find it and hunt it and kill it. And we knew that was wrong 50 years ago, and it's still to this day influencing management policy, especially in places like South Africa and Australia. It's not true. And when we don't know why sharks bite people. Anyone who tells you they know exactly why a wild animal does or doesn't do something is someone who you shouldn't trust about much. But the leading theory is mistaken identity. Sharks have, again, been in the ocean for a real long time, and for most of that time, everything in the water with them is potentially food. We're not food. No, sharks don't eat people ever. They do bite people sometimes, and when they do that, they almost always immediately go, "Ugh, what was that?" and swim away. You run into trouble if it was a bite from an animal with large jaws or on a critical artery. But the shark does not eat people ever, and certainly does not develop a taste for human flesh. That's the most important one. There's a bunch of throwaway lines, especially when people they learn there's a shark in the area and they're reading books about it to try to learn more. And some of the stuff they say is just bonkers. But that's the big one.
And it's interesting when you see or read interviews with Steven Spielberg on the set or, shortly before they started filming, he is like the number 1 perpetrator of these myths. He was really into it. And he'd say, do you know that sharks will actually go after you? And just like what we see in the movie, he was a 100% believer in that and was really
Yeah.
responsible for promoting all of that.
So hundreds of millions of humans go in the water each year. There is a shark near all of them, and the shark knows they're there, and it doesn't bother 99.999% of them. If we were on the menu, there would be a lot more than a few dozen bites a year.
Yeah.
Peter Benchley, the author of the book, felt so bad about what this movie did for sharks that he spent much of the rest of his life lobbying for shark conservation. His widow, Wendy Benchley, has an op-ed in USA Today about this. And there's now a Peter Benchley Conservation Award and things like this. Spielberg has not expressed remorse.
Oh, yes, he has.
Oh, look.
He actually issued kind of a formal apology for, admitting how much the film influenced perceptions of sharks and that he was very sorry for it. Now, I don't know if that was pressure, that he felt he needed to take some responsibility. But yeah, he says he regrets having promoted those myths. So,
All
uh,
right.
yeah. It's definitely. So you have a couple of questions here about the popularity of Shark Week, how that's affected conservation.
So Shark Week, for those of you who don't know what it is a supposedly a week-long series of educational documentaries that airs on the Discovery Channel every summer. It is a dumpster fire of lies, pseudoscience, and nonsense, and it is demonstrably not only not good, but bad for shark conservation as well as public understanding of science. We checked. We did a research project about this. At the time there were 206 hours of Shark Week that had been aired. We had two poor undergraduate researchers who had to watch all of it and write down everything that was in it. In 206 hours of television, there were only 6 things that Shark Week told their audience of millions that they could do to help save sharks, and 4 of those things were don't eat shark fin soup, which is something that their primarily Western audience is already not doing. So it is at best a missed opportunity, but it also promotes wrong information about what the threats to sharks are, wrong information about what possible solutions are, wrong information about basic biology and behavior, wrong information about who's working on helping this and how you can find them and help them. Shark Week is bad. Shark Week is bad for science. Shark Week is bad for conservation. Shark Week is extremely bad for representation. My field is more than 60% women. Shark Week not only has featured more male hosts than female hosts, they've featured more guys named Mike than women on the show. And that was when we did this study, that was the result that the Washington Post used for their headline about the research. And it led to Mike Rowe, who's a Discovery Channel host of Dirty Jobs with Mike Rowe, held up that headline and looked grumpy. And that was my Facebook profile picture for a year.
Haley asks about why Jaws had a major impact on the public when comparable other shark movies have not. And, the simple fact of the matter is it's a movie that is about human beings. Of course, the shark is the antagonist, but it is a film where the characters are really beautifully developed and beautifully played. And again, the idea that this is a film that really resonates with both primal fears, but also a sense of who we were in 1975 as a country. Um, I think the hatred of the authority figure, all these people who are having these disagreements over the way to conduct civic life. The guy who's really, Murray Hamilton's character, the mayor, is kind of a stupid guy, but he's very arrogant, and he is absolutely not interested in his charges, the citizens of this town. I think you can always see political resonances in that, no matter what period we're living in. Most
Linda, did you see that during COVID, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, said that the mayor in Jaws was his political hero? I mean,
Wow.
a person that is like a one-dimensional, this is a bad leader making bad choices character,
Right.
and the Prime Minister says he's his hero. My God.
Yeah, and it's so archetypal. Sometimes when you have archetypal stories or stories about an antagonist, like the evil shark versus the good townspeople, it's going to be very black and white, unambiguous. All the iterations that come after Jaws, I think, are, almost tongue in cheek. They're not really, and Sharknado is the biggest example. Those are not serious movies. When they try to be serious, even the Jaws 2 and 3, which I have to admit I've never seen.
You could skip them.
Yeah, I have a feeling that I'm not missing anything. And it is because I have to say, Steven Spielberg, very passionate about filmmaking and very passionate about making this movie as good as it could be. He felt very strongly that if he really compromised, and it was 27-year-old kid, he's basically made one movie feature. How do you stand your ground against a studio like Universal when they were, breathing down his neck and telling him, just shoot anything, just stop with this business? And the whole crew wants to kill him. They want to throw him in the water and drown him. And he will not compromise 1 inch because he has this vision, and it really is his vision. I would say the other person who is most responsible for the success of this movie is John Williams. That soundtrack is one of the most powerful soundtracks ever written for a film. And it does become the shark. When you have a piece of music that all you have to do is hear two notes and you know exactly what it is, that's iconic. But you got people on that film who really cared and knew what they were doing and were really genius at putting it together. So we have another question for David. Marilyn says, how do you tailor your science communications for different audiences? How do you work with local fishermen to convey your message? That's a really interesting question.
So this gets technical really fast in the language of communications and marketing and pedagogy, but the short answer is it's vitally important to tailor your communications to different audiences, meet people where they are. No one in the history of the world has ever been persuaded by you're stupid for caring about this when you should care about that. No one in the history of the world has ever been persuaded by you're stupid for disagreeing with me. If you really cared, you'd do this. So treating people with respect, meeting them where they are, understanding what they want, what they know, what they fear, what they're willing to compromise on and not. All of this is vitally important for public outreach efforts.
And then there's another question about how can the average citizen help shark conservation efforts? What can we do about this?
So the number one threat to sharks by far, so much that there's basically not really a number two threat, is unsustainable fishing practices. It helps that that's also the number one threat to marine biodiversity as a whole. So it's the same answer if you care about whales, if you care about fish, whatever. So what you can do to help is don't eat unsustainable seafood. Notice that I'm not saying we all have to become vegan and give up seafood entirely. You can absolutely do that, but we're not at the point where the science says we all have to, or the ocean is doomed. In fact, this is the subject of my upcoming book with Johns Hopkins University Press, which is Sustainable Seafood, a Concerned Consumer's Guide. I am finishing that up. It's due in a few weeks, so stay tuned. In the spring, that book will be available. But in the meantime, if you want a cheat sheet, the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch Guide is a good one. Anything that's green on that list, if you eat that, it's safe for sharks.
Great. I like that. I can do that. Definitely. I think we all can. And I think we are wrapped up with the questions. So we want to thank you very much for being here, for celebrating this film that is so complex and lasting in all of its effects, both good and bad. And I hope you all get to go out to see the movie on the big screen and then afterwards promote the idea and the, the conservation aspects of saving the sharks and try to forget about the irrationality of automatically hating them and realizing what an important species they are and supporting them. Thank you. Thank you for coming.